A couple of days ago, I made a video and I put it up on this channel, and it was called Is Islam Makhachev Boring? The point of the original video was to show some selected highlights, both from the third, fourth, and fifth round of Islam Makhachev's fight at UFC 322 over Jack Della Maddalena, and then to compare rounds 3, 4, and 5 to the DDP versus Khamzat fight. Some folks had said that there were some similarities between them, and to be clear, there are some similarities between them, but the point of the video was to show that, A, these claims of similarity between the two fights are largely overstated. And the big reason for that, of course, is JDM was offering much more resistance underneath to Islam than DDP ever did to Khamzat. I don't think that's really in dispute, and I don't know how anyone could argue otherwise. He was trying much more along the way to get something done. So that was point A. And then point B, to answer the question that the video title was about, is Islam boring? My basic view is that I didn't find him boring, and I think to say that he's so boring that it's on par with what you got with Khamzat DDP is exaggerated. However, I'm at least willing to meet people halfway on this one. I don't personally find him boring, but if you need this incredible amount of knowledge of fighting in order to understand what he's doing, and by the way, I'm not saying that I qualified for that. I'm just saying if that's the bar for entry to be able to appreciate a fighter, yeah, a lot of people are not going to like it. The vast majority of fans who watch MMA, whether we like it or not, are casual fans. On some level, the sport should be accessible to them. It should be something that they can enjoy without having to, yes, be a corner or a coach or some kind of expert. To the extent that there's a gap between what the casual fan knows and what the implementation of the athlete is, that's always going to be there. But if it's so significant that they can't even appreciate the pound for pound best fighter in the sport, there might be a problem. But as I indicated, you can't really point to the Islam fight as being like the apex problem. The problem was in other fights like Khamzat DDP, where I faced an enormous amount of pushback saying that that fight was stalling out and stalemating and deserved to be stood up at various points that it did. People resisted that idea. And I really go back to this. If you really want to combat some of these problems, you have to attack them where they are. They're really not visible in the Islam fight. They're much more visible in the Khamzat fight. Now, this video I made was not a traditional breakdown. As I said, I'm just really comparing rounds 3, 4, and 5 of the UFC 319 and UFC 322 main events. But then something happened along the way. I put this video out and I had not heard any coach speak. I had not heard any discussion of the players and their strategies involved. I didn't know that there was anything out there. And then someone hit me to the fact that Craig Jones had kind of spoken through one of his alt accounts on Reddit, and as well, Khabib Nurmagomedov had kind of weighed in. Khabib had said that they purposely, basically, did not pass the guard. They wanted to hang out in half guard. And in fact, Craig Jones kind of confirms this, where he notes when you're playing the kind of style of game that they're playing, you concede bottom half. That's not a position that you're trying to attack. But here was the problem that I really just didn't quite understand. The issue is if you actually look at what JDM does, he's not necessarily playing the strategy that Craig Jones is talking about here. And what I think happened is that JDM had a strategy in mind about what they wanted to do, and at various times did try to implement it, but also had a lot of problems along the way and kind of had a confused game plan where at times they're playing what they wanted to play, and at other times he was kind of resorting to a much more defensive half guard. Apparently, my understanding is if you just kind of look at this, the JDM team didn't want to get stuck underneath in half guard. You could hang out there for a little bit if you wanted, but the problem was, as they identified, and you can see this in one of Craig Jones's instructionals, they wanted anyway, JDM to be able to turn belly out, right? They wanted him to be able to use octopus guard and then be able to turn to get to his base underneath. Because if you've got 2-on-1 and you're breaking the grip, right, and there's nothing controlling you and you can turn belly out, there's no grip to hold you. You can just build height and you can be on your way. And in fact, JDM did this exact kind of thing against Bilal Muhammad. But the issue was that the Makhachev team knew to anticipate this. And so they purposely held half guard, which Craig Jones has identified in a previous instructional that this would be a problem.
So Matt creates the double leg. He elevates and he steps over the inside leg. And he uses the inside leg to keep Spencer's knee facing more towards the flag behind us. And now Spencer tries to turtle. Even without upper body control, he cannot turn.
Now, Craig Jones has also talked about the fact that from octopus guard, it's very risky to play from side control. So it's not that they necessarily wanted to hang out inside control, but they were kind of hoping that Islam would try to pass, and then they could use that moment where he's, let's say knee cutting, to then roll to their base, make sure that there's no grip established 2-on-1, and turn over. But like, for example, from my breakdown, just look at this situation here at 145 of round 3, where you can see JDM reaches up and tries to stop what appears to be an attempted knee cut. Now, you can argue that Islam was baiting this to get a defensive reaction out of Jack by this point in the fight. And in fact, I think that's what he was doing. But my response to that would be that it worked. Also, you can go to 106 of round 3, and you can see here's a situation where Islam is not necessarily turking the bottom leg to hold him in place. So here's a case where you don't have a Turk from Islam, and he does look like he is trying to pass. And by the way, these are not the only examples. He passes the guard outright at the end of round 3 in this fight. So the whole point I'm trying to make here is here's a clear-cut case where that attempted strategy that Craig is talking about in this Instagram post just doesn't really come to life. But if you go forward in the fight, so for example, looking at my notes here, you can look at 241 of round 4. You can see here, look at Islam pinning the bottom leg. But JDM eventually will still free it, and he actually gets to his base. But you can see here, this is not a Turk, but the pin serves a similar kind of purpose to slow the roll of JDM. Or, for example, you can go to 410 of round 5. Here you can see JDM's leg is turked, or at least there's a pinch happening. So that bottom leg, as Craig previously described, it can't turn over and he can't belly out. And then here's another example, 258 of round 5. This is such an obvious Turk where now you can see exactly what Islam was trying to do. I went down this rabbit hole of trying to answer a question about whether or not it's boring or whether we have a sufficient basis to say it's boring by comparing it to a previous fight that I think most observers would agree, and I would agree certainly, is boring, that being DDP Khamzat. And again, I don't really think that is fair. I think what Jack was trying to do underneath, and a lot of these Darce escapes that get you to buggy choke positions and whatnot, he was definitely trying. But I guess I just come down on the idea that he ended up getting away from the game plan, where at times there's no turking of the bottom leg and he's able to roll and he's got the 2-on-1. And there's other times where he's playing a much more defensive guard. And in fact, Ben Vickers spoke to Submission Radio about this and even said, by his own admission, that the problem was not the game plan. And in fact, they would go back to it. Let's answer the question. Is Islam Makhachev boring? As I stated previously, I don't believe that he is. And in fact, I think he's one of the most interesting talents I've ever seen. And I would also point out this maneuver that they use to stay in half guard and then turk that bottom leg when necessary, or in other cases, to bait the pass. It worked perfectly. It had Jack all out of sorts, where it's not in conjunction with what both of his coaches, Ben Vickers and Craig Jones, or training partners, whatever you want to call them, it doesn't cohere with what either of them are essentially saying, where the game plan wasn't the problem and this was the game plan. And then you just look at what Jack's doing and it's a confused mixture of the two. I think what you might be able to add is that, if Islam was basically intent, even if he was faking it at times, but if he was basically intent on hanging out in half guard, why wasn't there more ground and pound? Okay, fair enough. There could have been more ground and pound. Looked to me like maybe they were really chasing that sub, that he really wanted it. Again, this is something that Craig theorized that they probably wanted as well. That seems to me like a fair criticism. Again, I'm not making the argument that you have to think that Islam Makhachev is exciting. But I mean, this gets to the problem. You have to have a really, really, really high degree of literacy to appreciate the genius of what is happening here. I had to get some help along the way to figure some of this stuff out as well, because again, the tape was a little bit confusing. Half the time he's doing A, the other half of the time he's doing B, and it doesn't really work in the whole case. And then to see Islam turking this bottom leg to prevent the rotation of the hips, this requires a significant amount of insight into how the sport works. And it's just unrealistic to expect not merely most fans, but certainly not casual fans, to have this kind of an insight. And I just want to say one more time, the problem is not so much that you can't make criticisms of Islam or any kind of fight style that involves staying in a static position or relatively static position. I think that you can. What I am going to say, though, is that is critically different than stalling, stalemating, and the fight not ever going anywhere. Islam was chasing submissions. I know the UFC stats don't show that, but clearly the tape does. Whether they account for it based on their criteria is a different matter than whether or not he was actually going for it. That is so uniquely different than a guy in DDP having his guard passed immediately, getting to mount immediately, getting to the back whenever he wanted it, and then just not being able to advance the attack because either from the back, Khamzat doesn't want to let go of his grip. He wanted to maintain his grip, or he would get to crucifix and he had no meaningful ground and pound from there. That to me feels very, very different. That to me, when you have free and open access to basically whatever position you want, and you can get to those positions very, very easily whenever you want, it seems to me very different than you got a guy who, if you don't hold down, is going to be a little bit squirmy. You got to have a lot of different tricks to keep him there. And even if you do, you're going to have to work your way through it, even in a case where he has a very confused application of a game plan. So it's one of these answers where, I mean, I think we should be celebrating Islam. I think he is just such a spectacular and amazing talent. But I also think it's a mistake as a sport if we just say, oh, well, you're a casual, your opinion doesn't count. You have to have a high degree of literacy in these positions to really not only understand them, but that understanding is the kind of thing that produces adoration, the kind of thing that produces admiration, the kind of thing that produces a connective bond from fan to athlete. And it can be hard, in the modern era. It can be hard. If I may, I'd like to end on this point. Listen, I commentate MMA, not at the UFC level, at a smaller level. I'm very grateful for those gigs, and I work as hard as I can in them. And I'll be the very first person to tell you that MMA commentary is insanely difficult. And I don't say this as someone being like, oh, I could do those jobs that they do in the UFC. I'm telling you now, I can't. I'm not good enough for it. It's too hard. But what I am going to say is whoever is in that role, it'd be nice if they had, I don't know, a rotating cast beyond what they already have. Here's my point. A lot of times narratives about fights get driven by what the commentators say. Commentators will lead with something and it ends up taking on a life of its own. And my point is, if you had someone in that booth who could dissect octopus guard, who could dissect Z guard and the 2-on-1 grip, and they could sort of identify, wow, here's why JDM can't turn, there may have been more immediate knowledge given to the viewer in that moment to help them appreciate what Islam was doing, rather than this kind of basic observation, well, that Islam's on top, Jack's underneath, and Jack can't get anything going. Anyone can understand that. But what they can't understand is why that is happening. And there just wasn't a lot of explanation, in my opinion, by the commentators at that time to help us really get to a point where you could. I had to go digging myself. I had to wait for some of these revelations, and I do this for a living. And again, one more time, I am hardly the gold standard on anything. I'm just a guy trying my best. But I'm just pointing out, like, this is the kind of effort that has to go into these sorts of things. Having someone in that booth, if you've got a very important fight, if you've got guys with very specialized skill set, bring them in every once in a while. Try something out. The idea that the rotating cast of characters they have as commentators, many of them can be good, but that this is enough institutional knowledge among them to be able to articulate what's happening in any fight is simply just not the case. MMA commentary is hard to do. Things happen so fast. Things are disguised on purpose. It is really difficult, especially in a sport with no replay, to see what is happening. Maybe there's a case to get people in the booth who can get us to a more, as a viewing group, enlightened position by virtue of their own experience and understanding of these very, very intricate positions. In any case, Islam's great. Congratulations to his team. Hell of an effort. This debate will rage on, but at a bare minimum, at least we understand a little bit more about what's happening here.